Hi, I'm Annette Dubrouillet, and I'm here right now to read Chapter 6 of Mrs. Piggle by Betty MacDonald. We did have a little bit of a technical problem yesterday, so we missed Chapter 5, so I'm recording both Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 today, and as soon as I'm finished here, I'll go and upload them. Okay, so Chapter 6 is entitled, The Never Want to Go to Bedders Cure. Each evening as the clock struck 8, Mrs. Gray called to Bobby and Larry and Susan. She said, "Come, children, 8 o'clock, time for bed." She tried to make her voice sound cheerful and gay, but actually she felt like groaning because she knew what was coming. First, Susan. "Oh, we don't want to go to bed now, Ma. Please, Mother, let us stay up a little longer. Please, Mother, please." Then Bobby. "Oh, we are the only ones in our whole neighborhood who have to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Then Larry. "Mother, nobody, not anybody at all goes to bed at 8 o'clock. Then Susan again. "But Mother, we have only just started this game." Then Bobby. "Please, let us finish this game, please." Then Larry. "Just one more turn, Mother. It's my turn, Mother. I won't have won a game all evening, please." Mrs. Gray said, "Now, Bobby, Larry, and Susan, you know that if you want to grow up into fine young men and women, you must have plenty of sleep. I'm sure they teach you that in school." "We don't want to grow up. We just want to finish this game," Bobby wailed. And so night after night, poor Mrs. Gray argued and pled and begged the children to go to bed. And by the time they had finished whining and complaining, it was usually almost 9 o'clock. Mrs. Gray was desperate. Finally, one day, she called her friend, Mrs. Grassfeather. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Grassfeather, this is Mrs. Gray, and I would like to find out what time Catherine and Wilfred go to bed." Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Why, at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Gray?" "Well, unless their Uncle Jasper comes for dinner. And then I usually let them stay up till 9:30 to hear Uncle Jasper tell his experiences about the Boer War." That, of course, is strictly Mr. Grassfeather's idea. He only allows the children to stay up until 9:30, but he pays them as well for listening to Uncle Jasper while he goes to bed. Mrs. Gray said, "Do the children like to go to bed at 8 o'clock? Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Oh, they are very good about it because they know if they whine and complain, I will not let them stay up the next time Uncle Jasper comes over, which is about 4 times a week." As the Grays had no Uncle Jasper, Mrs. Gray realized that Mrs. Grassfeather could be of no help, so she said goodbye and hung up the phone. Then she called Mrs. Gardenfield. "Hello, Mrs. Gardenfield, this is Mrs. Gray, and I called to see what time Worthington and Guinevere go to bed at night." Mrs. Gardenfield said, "Oh, they go to bed any time after their daddy comes home. You see, Mrs. Gray, Mr. Gardenfield comes home at 4:30. We have dinner at 5:30. And the children, Mr. Gardenfield and I, are all go to bed at 6:30. 6:30? Said Mrs. Gray, amazed. "My goodness, that is early." Mrs. Gardenfield said, "It is not early if you get up at 4:30. Mrs. Gray said, "But who wants to get up at 4:30? "We do," said Mrs. Gardenfield, and hung up the phone in a huff. So Mrs. Gray thought, and suddenly she remembered that only yesterday Dick Thompson's mother had been telling her about a wonderful little woman named Mrs. Piggle. And so, even though she had never seen Mrs. Piggle, she decided to call her on the telephone and ask to help her with the Never Want to Go to Bedders. She said to Mrs. Piggle, "I am Mrs. Gray, and I'm the mother of Bobby, Larry, and Susan." Mrs. Piggle said, "Oh, yes, of course. How are the children? I have not seen them since they returned from camp." Mrs. Gray said, "Mrs. Piggle, Bobby, Larry, and Susan are very well and very cooperative until about 8 o'clock at night, and then they turn into whiny, complaining little non-cooperators." Mrs. Piggle said, "Oh, yes, I see. They are never want to go to bedders, aren't they?" Mrs. Gray said, "How on earth did you know?" Mrs. Piggle laughed and said, "Oh, that is one of the most common of the children's ailments. The moment you said that you were good until 8 o'clock, I knew what the trouble was." Mrs. Gray said, "Do you know anything to do for them? How to cure this hateful disease?" Mrs. Piggle said, "Oh, that's very simple. Beginning tonight, don't let them go to bed. Let them stay up as long as they want to. You and Mr. Gray go to bed any time you're tired, but leave the children downstairs." Mrs. Gray said, "But their health, that'll ruin their health." Mrs. Piggle said, "Oh, I do not believe that a day or so without sleep will harm them, but it will certainly cure them." "It's really worth a try, Mrs. Gray. But if you have any trouble and the cure doesn't seem to be working, call me." Mrs. Gray said, "Oh, thank you so much, Mrs. Piggle. I will let you know tomorrow how we are getting along." That night at 8 o'clock, the clock struck and Mrs. Gray continued to mend her socks and said nothing about bed. And Mr. Gray turned the television channel and Bobby and Larry and Susan played parcheesi. At 9 o'clock, the clock struck again, and Mrs. Gray put down the socks she was working on and took up a woman's magazine. Mr. Gray changed the TV, and Bobby and Larry and Susan continued to play parcheesi. When 10 o'clock struck, Mrs. Gray yawned and put down the magazine. Mr. Gray turned off the TV, and Larry and Susan and Bobby began another game of parcheesi. At 10:30, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went up to bed and left the children playing parcheesi. At 12 o'clock, Mrs. Gray woke up and at first thought there were burglars downstairs. Then she remembered the never-want-to-go-to-bedders. So she tiptoed down the stairs and there were Bobby and Larry and Susan playing parcheesi on the living room rug. And there's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Gray going upstairs and the children still playing parcheesi. The next morning, the children slept until 11:30. About 9 o'clock, Dick Thompson's mother stopped by to take them to the beach, but Mrs. Gray told her they were still asleep. When the children finally got up, they were cross and quarrelsome. When their mother told them about Mrs. Thompson inviting them to the beach, they said, "Why didn't you wait for us? Why didn't you wake us up? I think Mrs. Thompson's mean not to wait." And Mrs. Gray said, "I see no reason why Mrs. Thompson and Dick should have to spend their day spoiled their day waiting for 3 little members of the all-night parcheesi club to get up. Now come and eat your breakfast and stop complaining." That night after dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went to a movie picture show and left Larry and Bobby and Susan playing tiddlywinks. When the Grays came home about 12:30, the children were still up playing tiddlywinks and quarreling about whose turn it was. The next morning, they had 9 o'clock dentist appointment, so Mrs. Gray got them up at 8. Susan was so sleepy she could not eat her mush, and Larry yawned so much he choked on his egg and had to be turned upside down and shaken by his legs. Bobby just sat and rubbed his eyes. Bobby went to sleep in the car on the way to the dentist. Susan went to sleep in the dentist's waiting room, and Larry slept all the way home. That night, after their parents had gone to bed, Larry said, "Why do we have to stay in the house for all the time? Let's go outside and play." So they went outside and put on their roller skates and began skating up and down the dark street. Mrs. Milgram, who lived on the corner, came out of her front porch in her bathrobe and yelled, "For heaven's sakes, don't you children know what time? That it's almost midnight? What on earth are you doing up at this hour?" Larry said, "We don't have to go to bed anymore. We stay up late every night." Mrs. Milgram said, "Well, stay up someplace else and be quiet." She went into the house and slammed the door. So the children took off their skates and tiptoed back into the house. They got out the parcheesi board, but Susan said it was her turn for the pinks, and Larry said, "I happen to beg your pardon, but it is my turn." Susan said, "You had the pinks yesterday, and Bobby had them the day before, and it's my turn tonight," and she began to cry. Larry threw the pinks at her, and one of them went into the fireplace, and they had to strain through the ashes with their fingers until they found it. When they finally were ready to play, Bobby was asleep with his head on the board, and Susan and Larry played, jumping their men across Bobby's head, until Susan, too, fell asleep right in the middle of her turn. Larry woke Susan and Bobby, and they all went to bed just as the clock struck 1. The next day, there was a matinee at the neighborhood theater, and Mrs. Gray said they could go. It was a wonderful picture with Indians and cowboys and pioneers, and the children were very excited. But no sooner had they found their seats and settled back in the nice, dark theater when first Susan, then Bobby, and finally Larry fell asleep. They slept peacefully through the Indian picture, a Mickey Mouse cartoon, and a newsreel. When the show was over, all the other children went home to dinner, but Larry and Susan and Bobby slept on. Susan was the first to awake. She sat up and rubbed her eyes. Where was she? Why was it so dark? Oh, how stiff and cramped she was. She poked Larry and Bobby until they were awake too. They were frightened when they realized that they were still in the theater, now dark and empty except for 2 rats nibbling on popcorn in the front row. Susan began to cry. Everybody's gone and left us, and we'll have to stay here until we die, she bawled. Larry said, "Oh, Susan, don't be silly. All we have to do is walk out the door. Come on, everybody." They groped their way up the aisle to the door, but it was locked. They tried all the doors, but they were all locked. Susan began to cry again. "I'm hungry and I want to go home," she wailed. Bobby said, "I'll bet there's a back way, Larry. Let's look." They felt their way back down the aisle again and climbed up on the stage. Then suddenly they heard the front door open and a flashlight's bold light blinked in the darkness and a voice said, "Hey, what's going on here? What are you kids doing?" It was Mr. Murphy, the janitor, and the children were so glad to see him that they ran and clung to his legs and all talked at once. "Oh, Mr. Murphy, we were locked in and we must have fallen asleep in the picture. What time is it? Will you let us out?" Mr. Murphy laughed at them, let them out the front door, and drove them home. Mother and Daddy were in the living room playing bridge with the Andersons and seemed not at all surprised to see their children. Mrs. Gray said, "There's milk and bread on the kitchen table. Please put everything away when you're finished," and went on with her game. The children ambled over to the kitchen, but they were too tired to eat, so they went upstairs and flung themselves across their beds. After they had rested for a while, Larry suggested that they play burglar. They turned off all the lights upstairs and crept around behind doors and under beds and had a fine scary time until Larry pushed Bobby down the clothes chute and Bobby stuck and Susan screamed and Daddy came upstairs and yanked Bobby out and yelled at them all and sent them to their rooms. Susan and Bobby got right into bed and went to sleep, but Larry stayed awake until the guests had gone home and their mother and Daddy had gone to bed. Then he pinched Bobby awake and they both sneaked into Susan's rooms and pulled off her covers. Larry said, "Let's go downstairs and see if there are any sandwiches or cookies left." Susan was very sleepy, but she said, "Oh, all right." They ate about 10 little sandwiches and a small dish of salted nuts, 2 little dishes of candy, some olives and pickles, and some chocolate marshmallow cake. They felt very lively after that, so they sat down at the bridge table and began to play slapjack. When they finished the last game, the birds were singing, and they heard the thump of the morning newspaper on the porch. They scurried up to bed quickly. The next day was Patsy's birthday. It was a wonderful party with a fish pond and a magician who did tricks and games and balloons and prizes for every child. But Larry and Bobby and Susan did not enjoy it at all. Susan had such big black circles under her eyes that Patsy's mother thought she was sick and would not let her have any refreshments. Bobby was so sleepy that he fell asleep just as the magician pulled a rabbit from underneath his chair, and the magician thought Bobby was so rude he gave the rabbit to Hubert Prentice. Larry fell asleep right at the table. He laid his cheek in his ice cream, closed his eyes, and dreamed that he was at the North Pole. Patsy's mother called all the others to look at him, and he awoke very embarrassed. That night, when 8 o'clock came, Mr. and Mrs. Gray were working on the budget and not saying much, and Susan and Larry and Bobby were sitting at the Davenport, pinching each other to keep awake. As the last clock struck, bong, 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 the children jumped over and rushed over to their mother and father. They said, "It's 8 o'clock and time for bed. Please let us go to bed. We don't have to stay up anymore. Please don't make us stay up, please." Mrs. Gray said, "Well, I thought you enjoyed staying up late. I thought all the children in the neighborhood stayed up late." The children said, "Nobody has to stay up late but us. We just hate it. Please, may we go to bed, please?" Mrs. Gray said, "If Very well, children, from now on, if you are good, I will let you go to bed at 8 o'clock every night. And that's the end of chapter 6 of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle.